This webinar is the last session of the series, as I mentioned, and hopefully many of you had a chance to attend the other sessions. You'll notice it's in meeting format. You're welcome to show your face. We will have interactive components to this session. The series is all of the sharing is online and available for you. So you're welcome to take a look at that on our website, which is the link will be provided shortly if you didn't attend the other sessions. And a reminder to submit your reflection pieces for the certificate by the end of July if you're interested in this portion of the programming. So feel free to use the chat function throughout. We do not have a Q&A portion section, so you'll just have to use the chat for your questions. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Todd one last time to get this started. So Todd, over to you.
Good morning. And EJ, thanks very much for that. And, you know, this has been a really great experience moderating and co-creating these webinars with EJ and with our other panelists. And so good once again to work with Kyra and having these experiences of collaborating again. What I'm going to do is take us through a couple of slides. There we go. And talk a little bit about, so this is called an opening and a closing, and this is the closing. And what we're going to do is sort of take a look at the presentation that Kyra and I did in September when we kicked off this series. And then we'll look at what you said about that series, how we thought about the design and the selection of some of the presenters for this series. And Kyra's going to close up. We're going to ask you some questions, and then we're going to close up with a couple of final thoughts. And I hope that you enjoyed today's series session. Can we go to the next one, Kyra? So you told us, yeah, the next one. You told us that in September, you said that in this time of post Black Lives Matter and climate change, and especially the COVID that we were experiencing, that we are still experiencing, that we need to think about meaningful change in the sector that we're working in. And how can we do that? So this series is about talking about those kind of meaningful changes. Next one. And things that you told us that you think are really important that we should be including more. You clearly linked EDI, anti-racism to our work and an important part of our work. Interestingly, a lower imperative was a response to the TRC and reconciliation, or as one of our hosts, Corey Wilson, called it, reconciliation. We go to the next one. We took this on because we saw that you told us that we needed to have, you indicated our programs were low in these topics, and that we needed to include more discussions on the TRC and UNDRIP, on privilege, on equity, social justice, and intersectionality. And we selected topics that deal and are addressing these these topics. Can we go to the next one? So what we did was we looked for a framework, and Kyra provided us with a framework by Nesty and Sandhu. And thanks very much for this, Kyra, because it gave us a bit of a roadmap of how educational approaches can lead to transformation through the application of 8 principles. And we can see these 8 principles down the middle, the arrows leading to social transformation. The next one. Now, Nesty and Sandhu sees this as one direction going from educational approaches to social transformation. But, you know, I personally, and I think we saw it as maybe a little bit more of a dialectic, where an educational approach can bring about a social transformation, but as the society changes, that makes possible new educational perspectives and approaches. So there's more of a two-way influence happening here, a dialectic that's happening. And we wanted to make sure that we kept that dynamic alive in our conversations. Can we go next one, please? And in these 8 we looked at, or I wrote aspects, but 8 principles of Nestyan Sandhu's thinking. In our monthly webinars, these 3 topics or these 3 principles were core. They're core values of these were threads that went through every month's webinar that we presented: valuing diversity, the development of multi-perspectivity, and the combating of discrimination and promotion of social justice. Next one. Next. Thank you. Now, these 3, political and structural implications, alternatives to multiculturalism, and the development of equal opportunity, were emphasized by different presentations at different months. And just to run through, political and structural implications in October, Eduardo Contreras, Justin Wilson, and Darla Dierdoff looked at how do we reimagine the programs that we're designing and implementing. In November, Monroe, France, and Musa Magasa from Victoria showed us about building different kinds of initiatives that are more inclusive, that for our workplaces, the kind of work that we do and the partnerships that we're developing. In January, we welcomed Langara's Center for Intercultural Education, and they presented a case study on how an institution can create a center that will influence the educational practices and the work that actually happens in their own organization, the structural ways that it influences that. In April, we had Sonia Knudsen and Corey Wilson talking about reconciliation and reconciliation in the scopes of the work that they're doing. And finally, in May, we had Roheen Bojam and Derek Tanis, a really thoughtful presentation about looking at policy and how we as practitioners enact, embody, and can transform policy, how we lean into issues by how we interpret and then enact them. With regards to multiculturalism, I think Justin Wilson, Sonia Knudsen, and Corey Wilson presented new ways that we can think about multiculturalism, especially in terms of how we look at reconciliation. And in terms of equal opportunity, in October, we had Eduardo, a Latino and US American perspective, as a co-panelist with Justin Wilson. In November, Musa and Monroe brought an American, a global, an African, and a Canadian perspective to equal opportunity. In February, we had the very personal and touching experience of Minnie Jean Brown-Trickey, who shared her experience of achieving educational equity in the United States and now her life here in Canada. And then finally, in April, looking at Corey Wilson, I think presented a very strong voice. And I just want to give a shout out to Corey around that word. I keep using it everywhere, is reconciliation and what we can do. Can we go to the next slide, please? These 2 topics we covered less explicitly through the month, but I think later in this presentation, Kyra will be sharing a new model that she's going to leave you with, and that is a little bit of a teaser for her presentation at BCCIE's summer conference. But I think these 2, in relation to what EJ said in our opening, what happened in the circumstances in London, Ontario, the circumstances in Kamloops, and the circumstances in Thunder Bay have shown us how do we achieve solidarity and cohesion? How do we do conflict that is transformational so that our society can grow and develop? And I think Kyra will show us a couple of frameworks that will help us maybe to lean into these topics going forward in our work. Now, can we maybe, Kyra, we're going to transition over to you, and I think we're going to get to look at the Jamboard, I believe.
There you go. You were about to tell me I was muted. Wonderful. Thanks, Todd. A great summary of all of those excellent webinars and really months of this, hey? So that's fantastic. So yeah, what we want to do now is hear a little bit from the participants. I actually can't see how many folks are in here, but I'm trusting that EJ and Gab are going to figure out how to put folks into groups. And so what we're going to do is work with Jamboards, and you'll be popped into a room where EJ will drop in and give you a link so that you'll have the link to the Jamboard in your room. And what we'd like you to do is have a bit of a discussion or share on the Jamboard something important that you feel you learned from the series. And then on the other side of the Jamboard, we can be putting something I'd like to learn a little bit more about as a result of this series. So we do have some rules. I don't know how to go forward. Oh, hang on. My view just changed completely. There we go. Okay, so we're going to be in the rooms for about 10 minutes. And as I said, EJ's going to split you up into the breakout rooms and then pop in and give you the link. And you can see here that there's some rules of engagement. So we all know that active participation comes in many forms. So, you know, we encourage you to maybe turn on your microphone and video and have a conversation with colleagues in the room. But we also understand that some folks may feel more comfortable staying sort of off, but you can still participate in the Jamboard by grabbing a sticky and putting it onto the Jamboard. So most of you have probably used Jamboards with us before, but just in case, when you get the link, it's going to look a little bit like this. And if you go over and click on where that arrow goes, you will get a sticky note. And you can choose the color of your sticky note if you like. And then you can just type right into the sticky note, and then you'll put it either on the left side of the Jamboard if it's something that was important that you learned, and then the things that you'd like to learn more about will go on the right side of the Jamboard. And you can move those sticky notes just by grabbing them and moving them around. Okay, so I think we're ready, EJ. Okay, welcome back. I think most folks are returning from the abyss. Great. So by looking at what was happening in the rooms, the Jamboards, I think some folks were probably having really great conversations rather than maybe using the Post-its. So that's totally fine. But maybe because we couldn't hear those, maybe if you want to just put in the chat, maybe the highlights of your conversation about the topic of what you maybe what was something important you learned or something you'd like to learn more about. And in the meantime, I can share the Jamboards. Are you able to see that, Todd? The
Yeah, we can
Jamboard?
see it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So in this room, we probably had lots of conversation, less stickies maybe, but someone is talking about the Jedi. Love it. We are policy. Now, Todd, that would be from Musa's presentation, correct?
That would have been from Roheen and Derek, actually.
Ah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, talking about we embody policy. Yeah.
Great.
And I guess the Jedi might have actually come from the session that we did with the Center for Intercultural Education out of Langara. And I think that's one of their governing frameworks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's on the what I'd like to learn more about too. How can we implement, facilitate, share, or engage our institutions with Jedi and other initiatives that we've learned? Great. That's an excellent question. And maybe the framework we'll look at in a moment will provide some starting point for that.
You know, and the final one here about more transparent conversations, that's reminiscent of some of the things that Roheen in her new role at UBC was talking about, how they're trying to facilitate more open and more substantial dialogue across various departments.
Awesome. So I'll go to the next Jamboard. Is anyone putting anything in the chat there, Todd?
Oops, I can't see the chat right now. Where'd it go? Thanks for reminding me. Nope, not yet.
Put that one down. Okay, so here we've got, yes, perspective. We have to start the change, of course, right? The importance of beginning and continuing collegial discussion and learning. Yeah, great. And learning more about valuing different backgrounds and traditions. Nice. I think the next Jamboard is very populated, so I'll pop over there and we'll see what's, yes. So, there was a lot of activity in that room. Do you want to pull out a couple things to comment
Yeah,
on?
I'm looking, creating a third space. Okay. Okay, so looking at, what do we got here? So looking at systemic change, yeah, that went across a number of our months. The intersection of race and intercultural on our campuses. So that was something, Kyra, that you and I talked about quite a bit in the in the September session, and you know, it did carry through in a number of our webinars.
Yeah, and how are we going to support students in the return? That's the burning question.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Aligning policy and practice. It is interesting. This group today, maybe it's, you know, the fact that we talked a lot about policy in our more recent, you know, our April and our May session. Maybe this group is a policy group. They really like that. But I think it's interesting, you know, we're looking at structure now. We didn't used to have those conversations as much, Kyra, you know, years ago when you and I were having these conversations. Policy is coming up much more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know for sure on our campus, the policy focus is coming with the emphasis on EDI. And recognizing that we don't even have the policies that we need, let alone need to revise the policies, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting times, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple here around looking at intersectionality and how to encourage students and support students in discussion, dialogue around navigating those differences. And I think the next one to the right of it, talking about, you know, in the post-COVID Black Lives Matter era, you know, how do we continue these conversations and how do we create meaningful engagements? And I think the model that you're going to share, Kyra, in the next section actually might give people some insight into how they might start to approach those topics, if I'm correct.
Yeah, do you want to go there?
It might, I think, you know, a lot of these post-its are looking like they're going in the direction of, there's a certain affirmation of that, okay, we hit some targets in the, between September and May. And I think, you know, some of the things that people are saying they also want to learn more about, things that they liked that they learned and they want to learn more about. I think, yeah, this model that you're going to chat about, I think it might give people a taste of, oh, what could come next. Okay,
so I'm going to do a different sharing now. This is where we'll see if I actually can pull it off. Pretty sure it's this one.
I know this worked when we practiced.
I know it did. Is it working? Is it working?
I think you got it. Yeah.
Yay. Okay, good. Excellent. All right. So yeah, in talking with Todd around sort of all of the series and planning this closing series, we started talking about a model that some of you might be familiar with, but I've been finding it really interesting. So we wanted to share that with you briefly. And we will be, myself and Amy McLean will be doing a session at the conference, actually a week today. So if you're interested in talking more about it, join us then. But so one of the things we were talking about was, you know, how can we all collectively engage in the shift? Because we know there's a shift. You told us you wanted to see a shift in September, and many of these sessions have been working towards a shift. And so what I wanted to share with you was a paper that's in the Canadian Journal of Higher Education by Sharon Stein, Vanessa Andreotti, and Renee D'Souza, called Pluralizing Frameworks for Global Ethics in the Internationalization of Higher Education in Canada. And I wanted to share this with you. I think it has some real potential for us to sort of shift our conversations and maybe deepen our conversations around sort of what we do and why we're doing it. So what their paper is about is essentially they're asking for both scholars and practitioners working around internationalization to engage in sort of multi-voiced and critically informed analysis and conversations about the ethical dilemmas that are related to the work that we do. Essentially, right? So of course they recognize that there's, you know, multiple possible responses to these ethical dilemmas. And so instead of sort of telling us what's best practices or advocating for any specific ethical approach, what they've done in this paper is sort of offered us three different global ethics frameworks. And then they've taken three of the sort of main activities of internationalization and looked at them through these different ethics. And so I will show you what those are and give you a couple of examples. So the first one is thinking about a liberal ethic and what they do. So you can see that the activities of internationalization that they're using are international student mobility or recruitment, service and study abroad, and then internationalization of the curriculum. And so they look at this first through this idea of a global ethic, or a liberal global ethic, pardon me. And in the liberal frame, it's sort of, you'll recognize it as sort of familiar because it's the way we mostly operate, and it's certainly the way many of the conversations around internationalization at CBIE or BCCIE for many years have had this sort of framework. And what they're arguing is that they say the liberal ethic naturalizes the universalist ideal that there's really one way of knowing or being that's the most valid and valuable. So it's, you know, it's the liberal global imaginary that we've all been living in for many years. But the problem that they identify, and I think this is interesting, is that the ethical problems can be articulated within this idea of universalism, but it's also where the solutions get found. And so we never break out of it because we're always finding the solutions within that liberal ethical frame. And so it offers these gifts, but it also can limit the possibilities. So then the second frame that they are suggesting that we use a bit more potentially is a critical ethical frame. And so this operates from the edge of the liberal one, but it really is addressing ideas around power relations ongoing at an international scale. And thinking about how ethical responses that are articulated within the liberal one are often kind of dehistoricized or depoliticized. And so the critical frame comes in and says, we have to be talking about history, politics, and the inequities that have been reproduced through the sort of liberal imaginary, right? And also the critical frame often is recognizing the need to redistribute resources, look at governance, think about multiple ways of knowing and being, right? And then the final frame that they use is probably the most complicated, and I've a little bit tricky to even try to talk about this in a few minutes, but looking at a decolonial ethic. And in this frame, they would say that it's really emphasizing and denaturalizing the enduring impacts of coloniality. And from that liberal imaginary, it's really arguing that it's not to diminish or get rid of the liberal framework or imaginary, but to really interrupt it and decenter it from the only conversations that we're having, right? And to go alongside and say that all three of these ethics might offer us different ways of thinking about what we do and different ways of having these deeper conversations where we can sort of critique our own actions. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an example of what they would say, how this would work and how maybe we can use these frameworks when we're having discussions with our colleagues and trying to sort of push our thinking in ways that will deepen those conversations. So the first, I'm going to share with you two frameworks, sort of with the types of questions that Stein, Andreotti, and D'Souza bring up in the paper. And the first one is looking at, they are looking at international student mobility recruitment is sort of the topic. And in the liberal frame, the question might be something like this, and many of us have heard this, and you've probably even heard me talking about it at conferences in the past, right? How can we foster positive engagements between international and domestic students? It's a great question, but it's framed from this more of this liberal frame. And so if we then take it and think about, okay, what would a question from the critical ethical frame look like? And it might look like something like this, you know, how can we address racism? Because now we're talking about acknowledging these differential power relations and also the ongoing sort of polarizations, right? And then finally, from the decolonial, it gets even a little bit deeper, right? Perhaps. So how can we understand international students as neither victims nor villains, but rather as complex subjects who might be both subject to and complicit in others' marginalization? So you see how we kind of have this nested way of going a little bit deeper by using this frame. And right now, many of us are busy writing for grant money because there's now federal money available for student mobility, outgoing student mobility, right? So I wanted to share with you the types of questions that Stein, Andreotti, and D'Souza have put forward in these different ethical frames for study abroad and service abroad. And so this one, oops, not sure you can see it. Yeah. So in the liberal frame, we might be saying something like, how can a more diverse set of students gain access to these programs, right? And this is exactly what we see in the federal strategy. So funny, it's a liberal government in the liberal frame, but there you have it, right? So these are the kind of typical things that we're thinking about. And then if we sort of go a little bit thinking about that critical ethical frame, we might start asking some questions like this. So how does the structure of the program risk reproducing white saviorism and naturalizing the inequalities, right? And some of us might be asking these types of questions, right? So that's more from the critical frame. And then finally, in the decolonial frame, the authors of the paper suggest that we might be asking questions like this. So how can students begin to understand that they will need to disinvest from their presumed entitlements and develop a sense of responsibility to, rather than for, all living beings? So it's not, what they're not arguing that any one of these frames is better or worse, but just encouraging us to use these different ways of thinking to deepen our conversations and to think about the ethical dilemmas that are presented by the work that we do, and how we can maybe rethink or reframe some of that work towards thinking about the inequities and injustices that are all around us. But when we stay in that liberal global imaginary, we kind of can be a little easier to ignore them, right? Yeah, so that is a very large theory in a very short amount of time, but hopefully I maybe got your curiosity up a little bit about how we might use this sort of way of asking deeper and deeper questions to move some of the agendas that have been discussed during this series along in our institutions. So I would recommend you can download that article for free from the Canadian Journal of Higher Ed, and maybe even use some of those questions to start those conversations with your colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Kyra, for pointing out. Yeah, many of us are writing proposals for the rest of the month until June the 30th to promote this. And these are really timely questions, I think. For us to be able to critically analyze what are the values behind these calls, but also how can we lean into these? How can we lean into these practices that we have in our institutions? And earlier in our welcome, EJ talked about the events that happened in London and what has been happening in the territory that you live in, Kyra, in Kamloops. And I had alluded to what had happened in Thunder Bay, the sentencing of the fellow who murdered the woman with a trailer hitch a couple of years ago in his sentencing. These things are happening in our society, and our students, our international students, but also our our domestic students, we need to help them develop lenses and ways of making sense of this and leaning into these topics. And I guess my question would be, how can we ask these types of questions that are helpful for helping us, but also helping students working with domestic and international students to understand these kind of recent events that I just alluded to?
Yeah, well, I mean, for our students and for ourselves, right? I think the model, it invites us to consider how ethics shape our practice, right? And that could be in working with students or in, working with partners even. And sort of how framing the questions from these different ethical positions can invite new ways of thinking about the challenges. So, if we're thinking about current events, and yes, it's very current in my community right now, certainly, and well across the country, right? So, what we're really thinking about and talking about is racism at the core, right? So, a liberal question would maybe be something like, how can we teach students to be anti-racist, right? Which is a conversation that we're having on my campus and probably many others as well. But then maybe if we went a little bit more towards the critical ethic, the question might shift and be sort of like, how do we help students understand how they can be anti-racist given the historical and ongoing polarization and oppression based on race, right? Yeah. Or it could be something like, how do we help students to gain an appreciation of minoritized knowledges or ways of being and knowing, and also understand the oppressive practices that resulted in that minoritization, right? How did we get here? But then if we went to decolonial, maybe we would frame the question as something like, how can we prepare our students to navigate this increasing complexity that will necessitate, understanding and embracing not only different epistemologies or ways of knowing, but also different ontologies, different ways of being, and really understanding that if we're going to be able to survive and live together on the planet. So.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, probably, I'm looking at the chat. This has been a quiet chat in this session today. And I'm wondering if people have, I would encourage folks to ask questions. We're running down, this isn't a 90-minute session today, it's a 60-minute session. And if folks have questions, please populate the chat. Because I've got a follow-up for this as people sort of think about what their question might be and how they would like to ask the question. But I have a follow-up to that. We've seen the G7 and we've seen, right now, Trudeau's flying back from Europe, all of these international meetings, NATO, G7, et cetera. We're also looking at COVID vaccine distribution and it's the inequitable distribution across the world. And how could you talk about that with maybe think about that, framing it with your students as well?
The inequities of the COVID vaccine distribution?
Yes, yeah. If we think about this frame, how would you maybe think about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're thinking about from an educational point of view, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about global inequities, I guess, a question from the liberal ethic might be something around, well, how do we help our students become, engaged global citizens that recognize their privilege of being in a country where there's an access to vaccines. Whereas more critical framing might be, might push for not just a recognition of the privilege, but maybe more of an analysis of the power relations, right? So a question might be something around, what are the systems, right? The policies, the practices, the ideologies that reproduce the uneven distribution of wealth between the global north and the global south, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. And then, oh my goodness, a decolonial question, well, would probably be pushing, how do we denaturalize these notions of superiority or, really destabilize this idea that this is fair in some way, right? Because it fundamentally is not fair. But because we're occupying the liberal global imaginary, we can kind of carry on and pretend we don't notice, right? So how do we push to think about, you know, where do these assumptions of superiority come from, and how do we interrupt the patterns of dominance, be they racial, economic, ecological, whatever, right?
Yeah, Karina in the chat made a really interesting observation, how it was, I'll quote Karina, interesting how the G7 made a plan on supporting vaccines in the continent of Africa without collaborating with African leaders. So, underlining what you've just stated here. We're open. The phone lines are open. Bo has a question. What resources are there for educators and their institutions for internationalization and issues of returning to campus this coming fall?
Good question. I'm not sure, and maybe EJ can answer if there's any resources on BCCIE's end. I know there's been those sessions like chat conversations hosted by CBIE. They had one today, which they actually canceled, but there might be something being developed by them as well. Otherwise, I just know what's happening on my own campus around some of the things we're thinking about. Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I think there's so many issues with returning to campus, but one of the things that we're certainly looking at is anticipating an increase in racism.
Right. Carolyn asked about the nested slide that moves from liberal to decolonial perspective. Would you mind putting that up again?
Oh, I'm not sure which one she means, because she said, was there a slide? I don't know. Carolyn, turn on your mic and tell me what you're trying to get at.
Maybe, I'm not sure if there was one. Was there an initial slide that showed that the nest between, or I think you might have had separate slides showing the liberal to.
Yeah, well, what I did was I had here, I can just skip back for a sec. What I did was I showed the three lenses with the three different activities and explained a little bit about those. So there was decolonial, critical, liberal, right?
Right, okay, but there wasn't
and then
one
the
that showed the
nested
three.
ones was taking one of the topics. So this first one was sort of thinking about bringing international students to campus and what are the impacts of that. So through the liberal, through the critical, and then through the decolonial. And these are the questions that the authors of the paper actually offered us, right? And there's a number of other questions there. So that's what I was encouraging folks, take a look at at least the questions in that paper. They're quite provocative and provide us with a little bit of like, oh yeah, geez, thinking about it that way, right? Yeah.
I see that we're running close to the end of time, and I know EJ needs to come back. I want to acknowledge Bo asked about the specifically resources. So maybe EJ can respond to resources for people returning to campus. And Carrie, thank you very much for your kind words with regards to the sharing and that people have been doing throughout this series. And thank you very much, EJ, for being the hostess with the mostess on this series and working with you. I'll hand it over to, and thank you to everybody. It's been great. Thanks, Kyra. And back to you, EJ.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I'll just focus on the question for the resources. So it's kind of a plug for our conference. Our conference is next week, and we do have a group series of sort of conversations that are happening on the Friday afternoon. I believe it's from noon until 1 o'clock. Don't worry, the lunch break is from 11 to 12, so you will have time to eat. But they are actually in meeting form so that people can discuss those exact sort of challenges. So there are 3 that have different topics specifically, and a lot of it will be focusing on the return to campus in the fall. So I encourage you to look at that. And if you're going to be attending the conference, attend those sessions. They're facilitated conversations. So the intention is to have that conversation. And I think it was, I'm just looking in the section, Carrie mentioning like having a conversation about however how do we engage in this conversation for those who may not be at the same place as us? I think that's a really difficult question. And I think maybe that's something we can talk about, probably not this summer, but maybe in the fall. Maybe that's a really good conversation, sort of continuing on with this series, people who have really been a part of this series from start to finish, and sort of now, how do we continue that conversation and bring people into the conversation that aren't there yet? And how do we engage in that way? So thank you for bringing that up. Just because we have 1 minute, Kyra, Todd, thank you so much for walking us through the past year and really helping present a path forward. And those questions are super helpful to think about that. And thank you for obviously sharing all your insights and learning and that little dialogue at the end as well. Todd, I want to say a special thanks to you for being the moderator. I think when I asked you to be part of this series, you had no idea what you were getting yourself into. So thank you for throwing yourself into it and kind of being a part of this journey. It's been really a pleasure working with you. I've learned a lot from you. And I also am going to ask Gab quickly to turn on his screen. There are a lot of other people who make this happen. Gab was in the back end of this session, a few other sessions, and then Tara Lynn, who isn't here today. So thank you to them for the tech support, for the slides, for so much of the stuff that goes on behind the scene. Thank you so much. And then finally, thank you to all of you for being a part of this. You're the reason why we're doing this and making it happen. So we really appreciate that. There are some upcoming events. I think on the slide it says a reminder about the certificate. So July 31st is the deadline for that. We'll share some resources with you after this session, as we always do, in email. There's a great, some great stuff coming from Kyra's work that we'll share with you as well in the email. And so just to everybody, thank you again. Have a safe and healthy afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event, whatever that might be. So thank you, everybody. Oh, and there's going to be in the chat box, if you can do the survey, please do the survey as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kyra. Thanks, EJ. Thanks, Gab.